The glass shook in my hand before I even lifted it to my mouth. 3 days ago, my fiancé stood in front of 200 guests and walked out through the back door of the church, leaving me at the altar with a bouquet of white roses and a silence so loud it still rang in my ears. Tonight, I sat at the far end of a narrow bar on the edge of the city, trying to drown that silence in whiskey. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I had never been the kind of woman who drank alone. I used to laugh at the idea, back when my life still made sense, back when I believed the people around me meant what they said. Now I understood why some people needed a dim room and a stiff drink just to breathe. The bar was called the Amber Door, tucked between a shuttered bakery and a parking garage nobody used anymore. It was not the kind of place my friends would have chosen. That was exactly why I chose it. Nobody here knew my name. Nobody here would ask if I was okay, then look away before I could answer. My phone had not stopped buzzing since Saturday. Messages from my mother, who wanted to know what she should tell the relatives. Messages from my best friend, who kept saying she would come over, that I should not be alone right now. I turned the phone face down on the counter and let it vibrate itself into silence. I did not want comfort. I wanted 1 hour, where nobody needed anything from me, where I did not have to explain a decision that was never mine to make. I thought about the moment again, even though I had promised myself I would not. The church had smelled like lilies. My father had squeezed my hand at the top of the aisle, proud in a way he rarely allowed himself to be, and then the doors at the back had opened and closed, and my fiancé had simply not come through them from the other side. No note. No warning. Just an empty space where a future used to stand. The city outside the Amber Door moved on without noticing any of it, the way cities always do. Buses rattled past the window. A couple argued quietly on the sidewalk, then laughed, then kept walking. Life continued for everyone except the version of me sitting on that bar stool, still wearing the ring I had not yet found the courage to take off. The bartender, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a towel slung over his shoulder, refilled my glass without being asked. He had done it twice already. I did not protest. I needed the numbness more than I needed my pride. Somewhere behind me, in a corner booth swallowed by shadow, a man sat with his back against the wall and his eyes fixed on the door. Nobody in the bar paid him any attention. That, I would later learn, was exactly how he wanted it. His name was Damian Cross, and he ran more of this city than the mayor ever would, though almost no one who worked an honest job knew his face. I did not notice him, not that night. I was too busy staring at the amber liquid swirling in my glass, replaying the moment my fiancé's hand slipped out of mine in front of everyone we knew. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong, what I had missed, what version of myself I should have been to keep him from leaving. The whiskey did not answer. It never does. A group of men walked in around 11, loud and reckless, the kind of loud that comes from either too much confidence or too little sense. They ordered drinks, laughed too hard at their own jokes, and eventually noticed me sitting alone. I felt their eyes before I heard their voices. One of them, tall with a crooked grin, slid onto the stool beside me without asking. He smelled like cheap cologne and cigarettes. "You look like you could use some company," he said, leaning closer than I wanted him to. "I'm fine," I said, keeping my eyes on my glass. "Thank you." "Come on. Nobody sits alone looking like that, unless they want someone to talk to." I turned to face him, my patience already thin from the last 3 days. I said I'm fine. I'd like to be left alone. He laughed, glancing back at his friends as if my answer was a joke meant for them. Feisty. I like that. His hand landed on my arm, not gently. I pulled back, my chair scraping against the floor, my heart suddenly beating faster than the whiskey could explain. The bartender noticed and started around the counter, but before he could reach us, a voice cut through the noise of the bar, low and even, carrying a weight that made the room feel smaller. "She asked you to leave her alone." I turned. The man from the corner booth was standing now, close enough that I could see his face clearly for the first time. He was not loud. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes calm in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting ever could. The tall man's grin faltered. "This isn't your business, friend." "It became my business the moment you put your hand on her." Something shifted in the tall man's expression, a flicker of recognition, then something close to fear. He glanced at his friends, who had gone quiet, watching the exchange with sudden unease. Whatever they saw in the stranger's face was enough. Without another word, the tall man raised his hands in mock surrender and backed away, pulling his friends toward the door. Within a minute, they were gone, the bar's neon sign buzzing faintly in the silence they left behind. I sat there, stunned, my pulse still racing, unsure whether to feel grateful or unsettled. The stranger did not sit beside me. He simply nodded once, as if closing a chapter, and returned to his booth in the corner. "You didn't have to do that," I said, loud enough for him to hear across the room. He looked up, studying me for a long moment before answering. "No, I didn't." "Then why did you?" "Because nobody else in this room was going to." There was nothing charming or rehearsed in the way he said it, no attempt to impress me. It was simply a fact, delivered the way a man might state the weather. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all. I turned back to my drink, though my hands were no longer steady, and not because of the whiskey. I finished my glass and asked for the check, suddenly eager to leave, to breathe air that did not carry the weight of strangers watching me. The bartender waved a hand. "It's covered," he said. "Covered? By who?" He tilted his head toward the corner booth, where the stranger sat with a glass of water he had not touched all night. "Gentleman over there took care of it before you sat down." I stared at the bartender, certain I had misheard him. "Before I sat down? That was hours ago." "That's what he said. Said to keep your glass full and your tab covered. Didn't want anything in return." I turned to look at the man again, but his attention was elsewhere now, focused on the door, on the street outside, on something I could not see. My stomach tightened with a mixture of confusion and something I refused to name. Nobody paid for a stranger's night without wanting something. That was the world I had learned to expect, the world that had just humiliated me in front of 200 people days earlier. I gathered my coat and walked toward him, unable to leave without an answer. "Why did you pay for my drinks?" I asked, standing at the edge of his booth. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind his composed expression, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he understood exactly what it felt like to sit alone in a room full of people and still feel invisible. "You looked like someone who needed one night where nothing was taken from you," he said, "not even the price of a drink." The words landed harder than I expected. I had spent 3 days feeling like everything had been taken from me, my dignity, my future, my trust in people I thought I knew. This stranger, whoever he was, had somehow seen that without me saying a single word. "I don't even know your name," I said quietly. "Damien," he replied. "Damien Cross." "Claire," I said. "Claire Whitfield." He nodded, as though committing it to memory, though something in his eyes told me he had already known it before I said it aloud. I did not think much of that detail then. I would think of it later, when I understood exactly who Damien Cross was, and how little happened in this city without his knowledge. "Good night, Claire," he said, his tone final, offering no invitation to stay, no attempt to extend the moment into something more. I walked out of the amber door into the cold night air, my mind spinning with questions I could not answer. Behind me, through the window, I could feel his eyes following me, until I turned the corner and disappeared into the dark. I did not know it yet, but Damien Cross rarely let anything he found interesting simply walk away, and whether I wanted it or not, I had just become the most interesting thing he had seen in a long time. I walked 3 blocks before I realized my hands had finally stopped shaking, not because of the whiskey, but because of the strange, quiet certainty that somebody in that bar had truly seen me. It was a dangerous thought to carry home, though I did not yet understand how dangerous. I only knew that for the first time in 3 days, I had stopped thinking about the man who left me at the altar and started wondering about the one who stayed in the shadows, watching, waiting, already deciding that our story was far from finished. By the time I reached my apartment, the cold had cleared my head enough to feel foolish. I told myself it meant nothing, that a stranger paying for a few drinks and stepping in when a rude man overstepped was simply decency, nothing more. People were kind sometimes, even in a city that rarely rewarded kindness. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, slipped the ring off my finger for the first time since the wedding that never happened, and set it on the kitchen counter as though setting down a weight I had carried too long. Sleep did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the calm, unreadable expression on Damien Cross's face, the way he had stood between me and trouble without asking for anything in return. I told myself I would never see him again, that our paths had crossed only because I happened to choose the wrong bar on the wrong night. I did not yet know that Damien Cross did not believe in coincidence, and that somewhere across the city, he was already making a call to learn everything he could about the woman who had sat alone at the end of his bar, drinking to forget a life that had fallen apart, unaware that she had just stepped into the orbit of a man who let very little slip through his fingers once he decided he wanted to keep it close. My office phone rang at 9 in the morning with news that made my stomach drop. The client account I had spent 4 months building, the one my manager had promised would finally get me promoted, had been pulled overnight. No explanation, no warning, just a cold email from corporate saying the contract was terminated effective immediately. I sat at my desk staring at the screen, certain I had misread it, certain there had to be some mistake. My manager, a sharp woman named Vivian Hale, called me into her office an hour later, her face pale in a way I had never seen before. "I don't know what happened," she said. "The client called personally, said they were pulling out because of a scheduling conflict on their end. No complaints about your work, nothing about the numbers, it just doesn't add up." I did not know what to say. 4 months of late nights, of skipped dinners, of proving to myself that I could still function, even with my personal life in ruins, had disappeared in a single phone call. I walked back to my desk, feeling the same hollow ache I had carried since the wedding that never happened, as if the universe had decided I did not deserve to keep anything for long. That evening, I found myself back at the amber door, without fully deciding to go there. I told myself it was simply the closest bar to my apartment, that it had nothing to do with the man who had paid my tab 3 nights earlier. I ordered a glass of wine this time, something calmer than whiskey, and sat at the same end of the counter, though I did not let myself look toward the corner booth. He was there anyway. I felt it before I saw it, the same quiet weight in the air that had surrounded me the last time. When I finally turned, Damien Cross was watching me with an expression that gave nothing away, though something in his eyes told me he already knew about the client, about the sudden and inexplicable collapse of my biggest project. I walked over before I could talk myself out of it. "Did you do something?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He raised an eyebrow, unbothered by my tone. "Sit down, Claire." "That's not an answer." It wasn't a question I planned on answering standing up. I sat, mostly because my legs felt too unsteady to keep standing, mostly because some part of me needed to know the truth, even if I was not ready to hear it. The booth was quieter than the rest of the bar, tucked into a corner that muffled the noise around us, as though the world outside did not exist once you crossed into his space. "My biggest account fell through today," I said. No warning, no reason that made sense. "And 2 nights after a stranger tells the bartender to cover my drinks without wanting anything back, my career takes a hit like this. Forgive me if I find that hard to believe as a coincidence." Damien studied me for a long moment, his fingers wrapped loosely around a glass he never seemed to drink from. "I didn't touch your account, Claire." "Then how do you already know about it?" "Because I make it my business to know things," he said simply. "That's not the same as causing them." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" "No," he said. "It's supposed to make you understand who you're talking to." There was something unsettling about the way he said it. Not a threat exactly, but an honesty most people would have softened. I studied his face, searching for a crack in his composure, some sign that he was lying to protect himself. I found none. Whatever else Damien Cross was, he did not seem like a man who bothered with lies when the truth served him just as well. "Who are you?" I finally asked. "Really?" He leaned back slightly, considering the question longer than I expected. "I run several businesses in this city, real estate, shipping, a few restaurants you've probably eaten at without knowing I owned them." That's not an answer either. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "You're persistent." "I've had a bad week." Persistence is all I have left. For the first time, something in his expression softened, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. Some people in this city call me things I wouldn't say to your face. Let's leave it at that for tonight. I should have left then. Every instinct built by a lifetime of caution told me to finish my wine and walk out the door, to treat this strange, calm man as exactly the kind of danger my mother had warned me about growing up. Instead, I stayed, because for the first time in days, I was not thinking about the wedding that collapsed, or the account that vanished. I was thinking about the man across from me, and how little I understood about what he wanted from me, if he wanted anything at all. "Why did you help me the other night?" I asked again, needing an answer that made sense. "Because I don't like watching people get treated the way that man was about to treat you," he said. "It's not complicated. Everything about you feels complicated." He almost laughed at that, a low, brief sound that surprised me more than anything else he had said. "Maybe, but not the part where I decided you didn't deserve to be alone in a room full of people who wouldn't have helped you." A woman at the bar laughed loudly at something her friend said, the sound cutting through the quiet booth for a moment before fading again. I glanced toward the noise, grateful for the small distraction, before turning back to Damien, who had not looked away from me once. "You watch people very closely," I said. "It's a habit," he admitted, "one that keeps me useful in my line of work." "And what line of work requires you to watch people so closely?" "The kind where mistakes cost more than money." I did not know how to respond to that, so I changed the subject, asking about the restaurants he owned, the businesses he mentioned, anything to steer the conversation into safer waters. He answered some questions and deflected others with a skill that told me he had spent years learning exactly how much to reveal and how much to withhold. By the time I finished my wine, I had learned very little about who Damien Cross truly was, and yet I felt as though I understood him more than I understood most people I had known for years. Before I left the booth that night, he asked me one question that stayed with me long after I walked out into the cold. "Do you always drink alone when something breaks in your life, Claire, or is this new?" I considered lying, telling him it was simply a habit, something ordinary. Instead, I told him the truth, because something about the quiet way he asked made it easy to be honest. I used to have people I called when things fell apart. Lately, it feels safer to just sit with it myself. "Safer," he repeated, testing the word. "Or lonelier?" "Maybe both." He did not push further, did not offer the kind of hollow comfort people usually reached for in moments like that. He simply nodded, as though filing the answer away somewhere important, and let the silence between us settle into something almost comfortable. It was strange, sitting across from a man I barely knew, admitting things I had not said aloud to my own mother, yet somehow, in that dim corner booth, the words came easier than they ever had with people who claimed to know me well. 3 days passed before I saw him again. In that time, I threw myself into salvaging what remained of my career, staying late at the office, trying to convince Vivian and the rest of the team that the lost account was not the end of everything. On the 4th night, I walked home a different route than usual, cutting through a narrow alley I normally avoided because the streetlights there had been broken for months. I told myself it would save 10 minutes. I did not expect to need saving myself. 2 men stepped out from behind a dumpster halfway through the alley, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their intentions clear the moment one of them grabbed my bag and the other blocked my path forward. My heart slammed against my ribs. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound caught somewhere in my throat, choked by pure fear. Headlights swept across the alley before either man could touch me. A black car rolled to a stop at the alley's mouth, and the driver's door opened before the engine had even finished settling. I recognized the man who stepped out immediately, though I had never seen him move with such purpose before. Damien did not shout. He did not need to. His presence alone seemed to drain the confidence out of the 2 men in front of me, the same way it had drained the confidence out of the stranger in the bar days earlier. Whatever words passed between them happened too fast and too quiet for me to fully understand, but within seconds, both men had dropped my bag and disappeared down the alley in the opposite direction, swallowed by the dark. My legs finally gave out, and I sat down hard against the brick wall, my breathing ragged, my hands shaking harder than they had the night we first met. Damien crouched in front of me, his expression unreadable, but his voice gentler than I had heard it before. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I shook my head, unable to speak yet, my mind still catching up to what had almost happened. He picked up my bag from the ground and handed it back to me, then helped me to my feet with a steadiness that made me feel, for the first time in days, that I was not entirely alone in this city. "What are you doing here?" I finally managed to ask. "In this alley, at this exact moment." "I told you," he said quietly. "I make it my business to know things." "That's not an answer, Damien. That's the same thing you said before." He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, as though he was deciding how much of the truth I could handle. "I've had someone keeping an eye on you since the night we met, not because I don't trust you to take care of yourself. Because I've learned this city eats people who walk through it thinking they're invisible." I should have been furious. Somewhere beneath the fear and the relief, a part of me knew I should have demanded he stop watching me immediately, that I had not asked for a guardian I never agreed to have. Instead, standing in that dark alley with my pulse finally slowing and my hands still trembling, all I felt was a strange, unwelcome gratitude and a growing certainty that Damien Cross was far more dangerous and far more important to my life than I had allowed myself to believe. He walked me home that night, staying several steps behind me the entire way, never crowding the space I needed, never asking for anything more than the chance to see me safely to my door. When we reached my building, he did not come inside, did not ask to. He simply nodded once, the same way he had the night we met, and told me to lock my door behind me. Inside my apartment, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, replaying every detail of the alley in my mind, the way the two men had frozen at the sound of the car door, the way neither of them had said a single word before running. Whoever Damien Cross was to the rest of this city, he was clearly not a man people cross twice. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen. I hesitated before answering, my nerves still raw from the alley. "You made it inside," Damien's voice said, calm and steady, before I could even say hello. "How did you get this number?" "The same way I know most things, Claire." I should have found that unsettling. Instead, sitting alone in the quiet of my apartment, I found it oddly comforting, as though someone in this city had finally decided my safety mattered enough to keep track of it. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for tonight." "You don't have to thank me." "I know I don't have to." "I want to." There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable, as though my words had caught him off guard in a way few things did. "Get some rest," he finally said. "We'll talk soon." The call ended before I could ask what he meant by soon, or what exactly waited for me the next time our paths crossed. I lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, turning the strange, unsettling comfort of his voice over in my mind. Something about Damien Cross made the ordinary rules of caution feel distant, almost irrelevant, and that frightened me more than the two men in the alley ever had. I stood at my window long after he disappeared into the dark street below, watching the empty sidewalk where he had been, my mind spinning with questions I was no longer sure I wanted answered. Whoever Damien Cross truly was, whatever world he moved through when he was not sitting quietly in the corner of a bar, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. He was not simply a stranger who happened to notice me once. He had been watching over me since the very first night, and I had no idea yet how deep that world went, or how much it would eventually demand of me before it let me go. The envelope waiting on my desk had no return address, only my name written in neat, deliberate handwriting across the front. I almost threw it away, certain it was another piece of junk mail sliding through the office intake, but something about the weight of it stopped me. Inside was a single photograph of myself walking home 2 nights earlier, taken from across the street, along with a folded newspaper clipping about a man named Elias Grant, a name I had spent 3 years trying to forget. My hands went cold before my mind caught up to what I was seeing. Elias Grant was the reason I had once left a city 2 states away, in the middle of the night, with nothing but a suitcase and a plan to disappear. He was the reason I still checked over my shoulder on quiet streets, the reason certain sounds still made my chest tighten with a fear I had never fully explained to anyone, including the fiancé who had left me at the altar. I had believed, foolishly perhaps, that enough time and enough distance had finally buried that chapter of my life for good. I called Damien, before I even considered whether that was the right decision. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharpening the moment he heard the panic in mine. "Where are you?" he said. Not a question, a demand wrapped carefully enough to sound calm. "My office. Damien, someone left something for me. A photo, my name, and a clipping about someone from my past I never wanted to see again." "Don't leave the building," he said. "I'm coming to you." 15 minutes later, he walked through the glass doors of my office, looking nothing like the calm, composed man from the bar. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharper, scanning the room the way a soldier might scan a battlefield for threats hidden in plain sight. Vivian glanced up from her desk, startled by the sudden presence of a man who commanded attention without raising his voice, but I waved her off before she could ask questions I was not ready to answer. Before we reached the conference room, Vivian caught my arm gently, her eyes full of concern. "Claire, is everything all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice betrayed me. "Just a family matter. I need a few minutes." She glanced at Damien, taking in the sharp lines of his suit, the quiet authority radiating from him even as he stood still. "Take whatever time you need," she said carefully, clearly sensing this was not a conversation she should push further. I appreciated her restraint more than she would ever know. We sat in an empty conference room, the envelope between us on the table like something radioactive. Damien studied the photograph first, then the clipping, his expression unreadable in the careful way I had come to recognize as him controlling something dangerous beneath the surface. "Who is Elias Grant?" he asked, though something in his voice told me he already suspected the answer mattered more than he wanted to admit. I took a breath, steadying myself before the words came out. "Before I moved to this city, I was with someone. It started normal, the way these things always do. Then it stopped being normal. He didn't like when I spoke to other people. He didn't like when I left the apartment without telling him exactly where I was going. By the end, he didn't like anything about the person I used to be before I met him." Damien's hands, resting flat on the table, curled slowly into fists, though his voice remained level when he spoke. "Did he hurt you?" "Not the way you're imagining," I said quietly, though the truth was more complicated than a simple answer could hold. "He controlled everything. My schedule, my friendships, even the clothes I wore, because he decided what other men should and shouldn't be allowed to see. Every small freedom I gave up felt reasonable at the time, a way to keep the peace, a way to avoid the version of him that frightened me. It took almost 2 years before I understood how far I had let it go." I paused, gathering the strength to finish. "The night I finally left, I packed one suitcase while he was away on business, and I drove until the sun came up in a city I had never seen before. I told myself I would never let anyone have that much power over my life again. I left anyway. I moved here, changed my number, cut contact with almost everyone who might have known where to find me. I thought that chapter was finished." "It's not finished," Damien said, his voice quiet but final. "Someone found you. Someone sent this deliberately, which means they wanted you to know they could reach you whenever they chose to." The fear that had been sitting quietly in my chest since I opened the envelope sharpened into something close to panic. "You think it's him, Elias?" "I think," Damien said carefully, "that until I know for certain, you are not spending another night alone in that apartment." I wanted to argue, to insist I could handle this the way I had handled everything else in my life since arriving in this city, alone and without asking for help. But the memory of Elias's voice, low and controlling, the memory of nights spent afraid to fall asleep in my own home, silenced whatever protest I might have offered. I nodded instead, grateful in a way I did not fully understand, for a man who had, in the span of a single week, become the only person in this city who made me feel safe rather than exposed. That evening, Damien brought me to a building I had never noticed before, tucked behind a row of shops downtown, its entrance unmarked except for a small brass plate with no name on it. Inside, the space was quiet, elegant, entirely unlike the cold, transactional world I had imagined when he first admitted to running businesses most people did not fully understand. He led me to a room on the top floor, spacious and warm, with a view overlooking the city lights. "You'll stay here," he said, "until we know more." I walked to the window, taking in the view, trying to steady the storm of emotions rushing through me. "What is this place exactly?" "A property I keep for situations that require privacy," he said. "Only a handful of people know it exists. You'll be safe here while my people work to confirm who sent that envelope." "Your people," I repeated. "You make it sound like an army." "Some days it feels that way," he admitted, a rare trace of dry humor slipping into his voice. "But every one of them understands that your safety is not negotiable. Nobody gets near this building without my knowledge." "Damien, I can't just move into whatever this place is." "You can, and you will, because the alternative is sitting in your apartment, waiting to see whether the man who terrorized you for years decides tonight is the night he stops sending pictures and starts showing up in person." The bluntness of it struck something raw in me, but I could not argue with the truth of what he said. I sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion finally catching up to the fear that had carried me through the day, and studied the man standing near the window, his silhouette outlined against the city lights. "Why does this matter so much to you?" I asked. "I'm not someone in your world. I'm not family. I'm barely someone you know." Damien turned from the window, studying me with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thinner. "You're wrong about one thing, Claire. You stopped being barely someone I know the moment I watched a stranger put his hands on you and decided I couldn't let it happen. Everything since then has only made that feeling grow, not shrink." The confession, quiet and unguarded, landed somewhere deep in my chest, unraveling defenses I had spent years building. "You don't even know me," I said, though the words carried less conviction than they had a week earlier. "I know you drink alone when your world falls apart, instead of asking for help. I know you'd rather face danger by yourself than admit you're afraid. I know you left everything behind once already to survive, and you did it without anyone standing beside you." He paused, his voice dropping lower. "I know enough, Claire, and what I don't know yet, I intend to learn." I did not have a response for that. I simply sat there, caught between fear of my past and something entirely new stirring in my chest. Something I had not allowed myself to feel since long before Elias Grant taught me that trusting someone could cost more than it ever gave back. Over the following days, I learned pieces of Damien's world I had not been ready to see before. Men who answered to him with quiet, immediate respect. Conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room, not out of suspicion, but out of protection, as though everyone around him understood I was someone worth shielding from the details of what they did. I watched him take calls that made his jaw tighten, watched him give orders in a tone that left no room for argument, and slowly began to understand that the calm, careful man who paid for my drinks that first night was only one small piece of who Damien Cross truly was. One evening, sitting across from him at a small table in the private dining room downstairs, I finally asked the question I had been avoiding since the night in the alley. "What exactly do you do, Damien?" The real answer this time. He set down his glass, studying me with the same careful weighing of truth I had come to recognize. "I run an organization that most people in this city are afraid to name out loud. We deal in things the law doesn't always approve of. Money moves through channels most people never see. Problems get solved in ways that don't always follow the rules other people live by." I studied him across the table, searching for fear in myself and finding, strangely, none. "Do the men who work for you know about Elias? About what's happening?" "A few," Damien said. "The ones I trust most. They're already looking into where he's been, who he's spoken to, whether he's the one who sent that envelope, or whether someone else is using his name to frighten you." "Someone else?" "In my line of work, fear is a tool people borrow from each other constantly. It's possible Elias sent it himself. It's also possible someone who wants leverage over me chose your past as the easiest way to get to you." He paused, watching my reaction carefully. "Either way, I intend to find out before another envelope arrives." The thought that I might be a target not because of my own history, but because of my closeness to Damien, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. "So, this could be about you, not me." "It could be both," he said honestly. "I won't pretend the world I move through doesn't put people near me at risk. That's exactly why I'm not letting you go back to that apartment until I understand which threat we're dealing with." "You're telling me you're dangerous," I said quietly. "I'm telling you I'm honest," he corrected. "Dangerous, is a word other people use. I prefer to think of myself as someone who protects what matters to him, by whatever means the situation requires. And I matter to you now, is that what you're saying? His eyes held mine, steady and unwavering. You've mattered since the first night, Claire. I just wasn't sure you were ready to hear that yet. The confession settled over the table like something fragile and dangerous all at once. I thought of Elias, of the years I had spent learning to fear the intensity of a man who claimed to care about me, and felt the old instinct rise inside me, the urge to pull away before I could be hurt again. But something about Damien felt entirely different from that memory, a difference I could not yet name, but could feel, in the careful way he never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel smaller, to make himself feel larger. I need time, I said honestly. I need to understand what it means to be close to someone like you, before I decide what I want. Take the time you need, he said, without a trace of frustration in his voice. I'm not going anywhere, Claire, and neither is my protection, whether you decide to want more from me or not. A knock came at my door around midnight. I opened it to find Damien standing there, a folder in his hand, his expression grave. We found something, he said. One of my men traced the envelope to a courier service downtown. Whoever paid for the delivery used cash and gave a false name, but the courier remembered a detail. The man who dropped it off had a scar along his left hand, shaped like a crescent. My breath caught. Elias had a scar exactly like that, earned years ago in an accident he liked to tell people made him fearless. That's him, I whispered. That's Elias. Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw something colder pass behind his eyes. Something that made the powerful men I had watched him command earlier that week seem almost gentle by comparison. Then we know what we're dealing with, he said. I need you to trust me with what happens next. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to let him get close enough to hurt you again, whatever it takes. I searched his face, looking for the kind of controlling certainty that had once terrified me in Elias, the need to make every decision without allowing me a voice of my own. I did not find it. What I found instead was a man asking, in his own careful way, for permission to protect me, rather than assuming the right to control me. The difference mattered more than I could put into words. Okay, I said quietly. I trust you. He studied me a moment longer, as though weighing the weight of those two words, before nodding once and stepping back into the hallway. Get some sleep, Claire. Tomorrow, we start making sure he never finds you again. That night, alone in the room he had given me, I stood by the window and studied the city below, thinking about how quickly my life had changed since the night my fiancé walked away from our wedding. I had come to this city believing I would rebuild everything on my own, trusting no one, needing no one. Instead, I had found myself pulled into the orbit of a man whose world was built on danger and control, and yet somehow, for the first time since Elias Grant taught me to fear both, I did not feel afraid. I fell asleep that night, thinking not of Elias, not of the wedding that never happened, but of the steady, unshakable calm in Damien's voice when he told me he was not going anywhere. I did not yet know how soon that promise would be tested, or how far Damien Cross was willing to go to make sure the man from my past never found the chance to hurt me again. A car followed me from the office 3 days later, close enough that I noticed it through the side mirror of the cab Damien had insisted I use for every trip across the city. My driver, a quiet man named Elliot, who worked for Damien and rarely spoke unless necessary, noticed it at the same moment I did. We have company, Elliot said calmly, already adjusting his route, turning down streets that made no logical sense for our destination. The car behind us mirrored every turn, patient and deliberate, refusing to lose ground no matter how many corners we took. My heart pounded as I gripped the edge of my seat, memories of Elias's control rushing back with a force that made my hands tremble. Elliot picked up a small radio device from the dashboard and spoke into it in a low, clipped voice, alerting someone I could not see to our location and the situation unfolding around us. Within minutes, a second car appeared ahead of us, cutting off the vehicle following us with practiced precision. I watched through the rear window as two men stepped out of Damien's car and approached the driver of the pursuing vehicle, their movements calm but unmistakably purposeful. Whatever words passed between them, The pursuing car reversed sharply and disappeared down a side street before I could see who had been driving it. "You're safe," Elliot said, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Mr. Cross will want to know about this immediately." By the time I arrived at the building Damien had given me, he was already waiting in the lobby, his expression carved from stone, a phone pressed to his ear as he issued instructions I could not fully follow. He ended the call the moment he saw me and crossed the room in a few long strides, his hands finding my shoulders as though checking for himself that I was truly unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with a restraint that barely masked the anger beneath it. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice shook more than I wanted it to. Elliot handled it before anything happened. "It shouldn't have happened at all," Damien said, more to himself than to me, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the door, as though the threat might follow me even here. "I want you upstairs, now." Two of Damien's men stood near the entrance, speaking quietly into their phones, their expressions grim, in a way that told me the situation was being treated with far more seriousness than I had initially realized. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Oliver, caught Damien's eye and gave a small shake of his head, a silent signal that whatever information they had gathered had not been encouraging. I did not argue. Something in the sharp edge of his voice told me this was not the moment to test his patience, not when I could see the barely contained fury simmering beneath his usually composed exterior. We rode the elevator in silence, his hand resting protectively at the small of my back, and once we reached the room, he finally allowed himself to speak the words I could see building in him since the lobby. "It was him," Damien said. "Elias. My men identified the car. It's registered under a name he's used before in another city." The confirmation landed like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. "He's here, in this city, looking for me." "He's been here for over a week," Damien said grimly. "Long enough to send that envelope, long enough to have someone follow you today. My people are searching for the address he's using now, but he's careful. He's covered his tracks well." I sank onto the edge of the bed, the fear I had spent years trying to bury clawing its way back to the surface. "He won't stop," I whispered. "He never stops once he decides he wants something back." Damien crouched in front of me, taking my hands in his voice gentler than the anger still visible in his eyes. "He's not getting you back, Claire. I don't care what it costs, or how far I have to go to make that true." "You don't understand what he's capable of," I said, my voice breaking despite my effort to keep it steady. "He doesn't see rejection the way normal people do. He sees it as something to correct, something to fix by force, if gentleness doesn't work." "I understand exactly what he's capable of," Damien said, his voice low and certain. "Men like him only understand one language, and it isn't kindness. I've spent my life learning how to speak that language better than most people ever will." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "It means men like Elias respect power more than reason. He's spent years believing he's untouchable, because nobody ever stood in front of him and proved otherwise. That ends now. And if he doesn't back down?" Damien's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened further. "Then he learns the same lesson every person eventually learns when they threaten something I've decided to protect. It's not a lesson people forget twice." I thought of the years I had spent believing I was the only obstacle standing between myself and Elias's control, the endless nights spent convincing myself that escape was the only weapon I had. Sitting across from Damien now, I understood for the first time that I no longer had to face that fight entirely alone. The weight of what he was suggesting settled heavily in the room between us. I searched his face, looking for hesitation, for doubt, and found only quiet resolve. Whatever Damien intended to do to protect me, I understood he had already decided the cost was worth paying. 2 nights later, everything came to a head. I had gone downstairs to the small kitchen on the 2nd floor for water, unable to sleep, my mind circling endlessly around the fear that had settled into every corner of my thoughts. I did not notice the side door near the kitchen had been left slightly open until a shadow moved across the hallway wall, too tall, too familiar, freezing every muscle in my body at once. Elias stepped into the light, exactly as I remembered him, exactly as I had feared he would look if I ever saw him again. His eyes found mine with a calm, possessive certainty that made my blood run cold. "Hello, Claire," he said softly, as though no time had passed at all, as though the years and the miles between us meant nothing. "You look surprised to see me." "How did you get in here?" I managed to whisper, backing slowly toward the counter, my hand searching blindly for anything that might serve as protection. "Your new friend isn't as careful as he thinks," Elias said, taking a slow step closer. "Neither are you, running off with a man like that. Did you really think he could keep you safe from me?" "Get away from me," I said, my voice trembling but firm, years of buried anger finally rising to meet the fear. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Elias's expression shifted, the calm mask slipping into something colder, something I remembered too well from the nights that had finally driven me to leave everything behind. "You don't get to decide that anymore," he said, closing the distance between us. The kitchen door burst open before he could reach me, and Damien stepped through it with a speed and controlled fury I had never witnessed from him before. Whatever calm composure he usually carried was gone entirely, replaced by something sharp and immediate, a version of him built for exactly this moment. "Step away from her," Damien said, his voice a low, dangerous command that filled the small room completely. Elias turned, sizing up the man standing between us, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his face before his arrogance reasserted itself. "This doesn't concern you." "She is the only thing that concerns me right now," Damien said, "and you have exactly one chance to walk out of this building before I make sure you never walk anywhere again." The two men stared each other down, the air in the room thick with a tension I could feel pressing against my chest. For a moment, I thought Elias might actually attempt something reckless, driven by the same possessive arrogance that had controlled every part of our relationship years earlier. Instead, something in Damien's stillness, in the absolute certainty behind his words, finally broke through Elias's confidence. "This isn't over," Elias said, backing slowly toward the door, his eyes still fixed on me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "It is," Damien said simply. "You just don't know it yet." Two men I recognized from Damien's inner circle appeared in the doorway behind Elias, blocking his retreat long enough for Damien to cross the room and pull me gently behind him, shielding me completely from view. Whatever happened next unfolded too fast for me to fully process, a blur of movement and quiet, controlled voices, until Elias was gone, escorted out by men who left no room for argument or resistance. I stood frozen in the kitchen long after the door closed, my body finally allowing the shaking to take over, now that the danger had passed. Damien turned to me immediately, his hands gentle, despite the fury still visible in his eyes, checking every inch of me, as though needing physical proof that I remained unharmed. "He's gone," Damien said softly, "for tonight. But I promise you, Claire, he will never get that close to you again." I collapsed against him, the exhaustion of years spent running finally catching up to me all at once. He wrapped his arms around me without hesitation, holding me steady while I let the fear I had carried for so long finally spill out in quiet, broken sobs. "I thought I was safe," I whispered against his chest. "I thought I finally escaped him." "You are safe," Damien said, his voice firm despite the tenderness in it. "I promise you, whatever it takes, he will never have the chance to control your life again." We stood there for a long time, the kitchen silent, except for my breathing, slowly steadying against the warmth of him. For the first time since the envelope arrived on my desk, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, finally, I had found someone whose protection came without conditions, without control, without the quiet demand for ownership that had defined every moment of my life with Elias. Oliver appeared in the doorway an hour later, his expression carefully neutral in the way I had come to recognize as men trying not to alarm me further. He spoke quietly to Damien in the hallway, though I caught fragments of the conversation drifting through the open door. Elias had been tracked to a rented apartment on the east side of the city, paid for in cash under a name that matched the courier service's records. He had arrived alone, though Oliver suspected he had at least one associate helping him watch my movements. Damien returned to the room a few minutes later, his expression composed once more, though the tightness around his eyes told me the conversation had not eased his concern. "We know where he's staying," he said. "That's more than we had this morning." What happens now? Now I make sure he understands that this city isn't a place he gets to hide in without consequences. He sat beside me, his voice softening. You don't need to worry about the details, Claire. I only need you to trust that I know how to handle men like him without putting you in more danger than you're already in. I nodded, though the fear had not fully left my body, my hands still faintly trembling from the confrontation in the kitchen. I keep thinking about how close he got, I admitted. How easily he found his way inside. That was a mistake on our part, Damien said, frustration flickering across his features for the first time since the ordeal began. One that won't happen again. I'm doubling security around this building tonight, and every night until Elias is no longer a threat to you. Later that night, Damien sat beside me on the edge of the bed, his hand resting over mine, his expression heavy with something he seemed hesitant to say aloud. There's something you should know, he finally said. Men like Elias don't simply disappear because they're frightened once. Tomorrow, I intend to make sure he understands exactly how permanent tonight's warning was meant to be. I studied his face, searching for the fear I should have felt at those words, the fear that should have reminded me how far outside ordinary life I had wandered since the night we met. Instead, I found only a quiet, steady relief, a certainty that for the first time in years, someone stood firmly between me and the danger that had haunted every corner of my life. Do what you have to do, I said quietly. I trust you, Damien. He studied me for a long moment, as though weighing the full weight of what I had just given him, before nodding once, his resolve settling into something unshakable. Whatever happened next, I understood with absolute certainty that Damien Cross intended to make sure Elias Grant never had the chance to threaten either of us again. The message arrived at dawn, a single line on Damien's phone that made him go very still as he read it. I watched from across the room, my heart climbing into my throat, certain that whatever the message said would decide the direction of everything that came next. Elias left the city, Damien said finally, his voice measured, careful, as though testing whether the words felt true even as he spoke them. Last night, boarded a flight under an assumed name, but my contact at the airport confirmed his face on the security footage. He's gone, I repeated, the words feeling foreign in my mouth, too simple to hold the weight of years spent fearing this exact outcome. For now, Damien said, I made it very clear last night, after he left this building, that returning would cost him more than his pride. Men like Elias understand threats better than promises. I think, for the first time, he understood exactly how serious mine was. I sank onto the edge of the couch, relief and disbelief tangling together, until I could not separate one feeling from the other. 3 years of looking over my shoulder, 3 years of flinching at unfamiliar footsteps behind me on quiet streets, and somehow, in the span of a single week, it had ended. What did you say to him? I asked quietly. Damien's expression remained composed, though something flickered behind his eyes, a memory he chose not to fully share. I told him the truth, that the version of his life where he controlled you had already ended the moment you walked away 3 years ago, and that the version where he tried to reclaim that control would end far worse for him than anything he'd experienced before. I did not ask for further details. Some part of me understood that the specifics belonged to a world I was only beginning to glimpse, a world where Damien operated by rules I did not fully understand and was not certain I needed to. What mattered, sitting there in the quiet morning light, was the simple, overwhelming fact that Elias Grant was gone, and for the first time in 3 years, I believed he might actually stay gone. That afternoon, I finally called my mother, who had left 7 messages over the past month, each one more worried than the last. I did not tell her everything, not yet, not the parts about Elias or the danger that had followed me through dark alleys and quiet hallways. I told her simply that I had met someone steady, someone who made me feel safe in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. Is he good to you? My mother asked, the same question she had asked about every man I had ever mentioned, though this time her voice carried a cautious hope rather than the worry I usually heard. He's the best thing that's happened to me in years, I said honestly, surprising myself with how easily the words came. The days that followed felt strange in their ordinary calm. I returned to the office, where Vivian greeted me with careful warmth, never pushing for details about the family emergency I had vaguely mentioned during my absence. My old account, the one that had inexplicably collapsed weeks earlier, mysteriously found new life. A call from the client explaining a scheduling misunderstanding that had finally been resolved. I did not ask Damien whether he had anything to do with that particular resolution. Some questions, I was learning, did not require answers to understand the truth behind them. Damien and I settled into something neither of us named directly, though it existed clearly enough in the small, steady ways he showed up in my life. Dinners at the restaurant downstairs from the building that had become, without either of us fully deciding it, something close to home. Quiet mornings where he brought coffee to the room before leaving for whatever business demanded his attention that day. Evenings spent talking about nothing important, laughing at stories from childhoods that could not have been more different, slowly filling in the pieces of each other neither of us had been ready to share before. I learned that he had grown up in a small apartment above a tailor shop his mother ran alone after his father disappeared when Damien was 9 years old. I learned that he had built everything he had from nothing, one careful decision at a time, protecting his mother and younger sister with a fierce loyalty that had eventually grown into the empire he now commanded. He learned that I had spent my childhood constantly moving from city to city, chasing my father's unstable career, never quite settling long enough to call anywhere home, until I arrived in this one. "Maybe that's why I understood you so quickly," he said one evening, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights. Neither of us ever had the luxury of feeling completely safe until we built that safety ourselves. "Is that what I am to you?" I asked. "Something you built?" He laughed softly, shaking his head. "No, Claire. You're the first thing in years I didn't have to build. You simply arrived, exactly the way you were, and somehow made everything I had already built feel like it finally had a purpose." I did not have words steady enough to answer that, so I simply leaned into him, letting the quiet warmth of the moment speak for itself. One evening, 3 weeks after Elias disappeared from the city, Damien took me back to the amber door, the same corner booth where everything between us had quietly begun. The bartender recognized me immediately, offering a knowing smile as he set a glass of wine in front of me without being asked. "Feels different being back here," I said, glancing around the familiar room, remembering the woman who had sat alone at this bar weeks earlier. Drowning grief she did not yet understand would lead her somewhere entirely unexpected. "Good different, or bad different?" Damien asked, watching me carefully. "Good," I said, and meant it completely. I used to come here to disappear. Now it feels like the place where I finally started to be seen. "Do you remember what you said to me, that very first night, when I asked why you paid for my drinks?" I asked. "That you looked like someone who needed one night where nothing was taken from you," he said, without hesitation, as though the memory had stayed as sharp for him as it had for me. "I thought about that for weeks afterward," I admitted. It was such a strange thing for a stranger to say, and yet it was exactly what I needed to hear, even if I didn't understand why at the time. Damien reached across the table, his hand finding mine with the same steady certainty that had carried me through every dangerous moment of the past month. "I meant what I said that first night, Claire. Nobody in that room was going to help you, so I decided I would. I didn't expect that decision to change my entire life." "Has it?" I asked. "Changed your life, I mean." "More than I care to admit out loud," he said, a rare, unguarded smile crossing his face. "I've spent years building walls around myself, convincing everyone around me, including myself, that I didn't need anything soft in my life to survive it. Then a woman sat alone at the end of my bar, drinking to forget a wedding that fell apart, and something about her refused to let me stay behind those walls any longer." The confession settled warmly in my chest, chasing away the last remnants of fear that had followed me since the envelope first appeared on my desk. I studied the man across from me, remembering every version of him I had witnessed over the past weeks. The calm stranger who paid for my drinks without wanting anything in return. The protector who appeared in a dark alley exactly when I needed him most. The controlled fury standing between me and Elias, refusing to let danger reach the woman he had quietly decided mattered more than his own carefully guarded distance from the world. "I spent so long being afraid of men who wanted to control me," I admitted. "I think part of me was terrified you would turn out to be the same, just wrapped in a different kind of danger. And now, Damien asked quietly, now I understand there's a difference between someone who wants to own you and someone who simply wants to stand beside you while you decide who you want to become. I squeezed his hand gently. You've never once tried to make that decision for me, Damien. Not even when it would have been easier for you if you had. That's not the kind of man I want to be, he said simply. Not to you, not ever. We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the noise of the bar fading into the background, the same way it had that very first night, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. I thought about the woman who had walked into the amber door weeks earlier, believing her life had reached its lowest point, unaware that the man watching quietly from the corner booth would become the reason she finally understood what safety, and eventually love, could actually feel like. Later that night, walking back to the building that had slowly become home, Damien stopped beneath a streetlight, turning to face me with an expression more serious than I had seen from him in days. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer isn't the one I'm hoping for. My heart quickened, uncertain what question could bring such careful weight into his voice. Okay. The life I live, Claire, the world I move through every day, it doesn't get simpler from here. There will be more nights like the one with Elias, more danger that follows me the way shadows follow light. I won't pretend otherwise, not to you, not after everything we've already survived together. He paused, studying my face carefully. Knowing all of that, do you still want to stay in this? In whatever this has become between us? I did not hesitate, though the honesty of the question deserved careful consideration. I thought of the 3 years I had spent running from danger, building a life defined entirely by fear and self-protection. I thought of the woman who had sat alone at a bar, believing safety meant isolation, believing love meant eventually losing control of herself the way she once had with Elias. Then I thought of every moment since, every quiet act of protection that had never once demanded ownership in return. I spent 3 years running from a man who wanted to control every part of my life, I said. I'm not interested in running from a man who simply wants to protect the parts of my life I choose to share with him. Yes, Damien, I want to stay in this, whatever this becomes. Something shifted in his expression, relief and something deeper, warmer, settling into the lines of his face. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from my cheek with a gentleness that contradicted everything the rest of the city believed about who Damien Cross truly was. Then I promise you this, he said quietly. Whatever comes next, you will never have to face it drinking alone in a corner, hoping someone notices you're hurting. I noticed the first night, Claire, and I don't intend to stop. He reached into his coat pocket then, and for a moment my breath caught, certain I understood what was about to happen, uncertain whether I was ready for it. Instead, he produced a small, folded piece of paper, the newspaper clipping about Elias Grant that had once terrified me so completely. I kept this, he said, not as a reminder of the fear, but as a reminder of how far you've already come. I want you to have it back, if you're ready. A symbol that the chapter is finally closed, on your own terms this time. I took the paper from his hand, studying the worn edges, the fear it once represented feeling distant now, almost unfamiliar. Without a word, I tore it slowly in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall into a nearby trash bin, as though releasing the last physical weight of a past I no longer needed to carry. Thank you, I said quietly, for understanding that I needed to be the one to end it. That's the only way endings mean anything, he said, when they belong to the person who lived through them. We stood beneath that streetlight for a long moment, the city moving quietly around us, indifferent to the fact that two people who had both spent years guarding themselves against the world had finally, cautiously, chosen to stop guarding themselves against each other. I thought about how strange it was that the worst week of my life, the week my wedding collapsed, and my career nearly followed it, had somehow led me directly to the one person who made every broken piece of that week feel like it had been leading somewhere worth arriving at. 6 months later, I stood once again in the amber door, though this time I was not alone at the bar, and I was not drinking to forget anything at all. Damien sat beside me, his hand resting easily over mine on the counter, the bartender greeting us both by name now, a small, ordinary kindness that had become one of my favorite parts of the life I had slowly built in this city. To new beginnings, Damien said, raising his glass toward mine. To being seen, I added, echoing the truth that had defined everything between us since the very first night. Even when we think nobody's watching. He smiled, the rare, unguarded smile I had come to treasure more than almost anything else in my life. Someone's always watching, Claire. The trick is finding the one person whose attention you actually want. I thought of the woman who had walked into this bar months earlier, broken and certain her story had reached its lowest point. I thought of everything that had happened since, the danger, the fear, the slow, careful unraveling of walls neither of us had expected to lower for anyone. Sitting there beside Damien, safe and finally, fully seen, I understood that my story had not ended the night my wedding collapsed. It had only just begun, in a quiet corner booth, under the watchful eyes of a man the rest of the city feared, but who had only ever shown me gentleness, patience, and a love built on protection rather than control. Vivian had asked me recently, over lunch one afternoon, whether I ever regretted the wedding that fell apart, the humiliation of standing alone at the altar while 200 guests watched my future disappear through a back door. I told her the truth, the same truth I repeated quietly to myself some nights when the memory still surfaced unexpectedly. I did not regret it at all. That collapse, painful as it had cleared a path toward something I never would have found otherwise, sitting comfortably inside a life that had never truly fit me in the first place. Damien squeezed my hand gently, pulling my attention back to the present, to the warm lights of the amber door, and the quiet hum of conversation around us. "Where did you go just now?" he asked. "Just thinking about how strange it is," I said, "that the worst night of my life led me to the best decision I ever made, without me even realizing it was happening. Sometimes the worst nights are simply the universe clearing space for something better," he said. I stopped questioning it a long time ago. Outside, the city moved on the way it always had, indifferent to the quiet transformation that had taken place within these walls. But inside the amber door, in the same booth where a lonely woman had once drowned her sorrows in whiskey, unaware she was being watched, a new story had taken root, one built not on fear, but on the simple, steady certainty that some people find each other exactly when they need to, in the most unexpected corners of the world, when they least expect to be seen at all.